extra thick!
What's poppin' YouTube? Extra Thick Games back at it again, bringing you my very first deck profile. Now, I mentioned in my first video that I would be making all sorts of competitive deck profiles for your viewing pleasure, and that's true. While this one might not be the most meta deck in the world, I've taken this deck to several regionals and done extremely well, averaging at about 3rd place at each event. And the deck that I'm of course talking about is Darklords. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. For your main deck, you're of course going to want to start off with your 3 Darklord thick shells, right? This is the bread and butter of the deck, the draw power in monster form. Definitely got to have a 3 of her, and she extends your plays so much by just giving you so many more resources. It's ridiculous. Gotta play Darklord thick shell. Next, we're going to have triple Darklord Nastin. Now, this card unbricks your hand so much, it's absolutely ridiculous. You can discard several monsters that you just can't seem to get on the board, and then you just special summon it out, and it'll lead into rank 7 plays, if applicable. Or it can give you tribute fodder for other monsters that we'll get to here in just a moment. Next, we gotta play 3 Darklord Superbia. This deck does all sorts of graveyard interactions, and this card here is spectacular in the fact that when you revive it, it revives something else. There is a funky ruling where if it's revived by the effect of another Darklord monster, that it'll miss timing, but it does it on its own more than well enough when you revive it with something like Monster Reborn or Darklord Contact, to the point where this won't even be an issue. Now for one monster that we're running 2 of in the deck is Darklord Zerato. This card saves you so many times when you're going up against the meta. It has a built-in Raigeki effect and a special summon clause regarding the graveyard, which the Darklords play very, very much around. You get extra linked, this deck doesn't care one bit. Darklord Zerato, you have to play this card in your deck, and it's a level 8, so it's another trade-in target to be revived later by cards like Darklord Superbia or your other spell cards. Wrapping up the Darklord lineup, we of course have the one copy of the devil himself, Darklord Morningstar. Now, you can play this card if you want. I would never run it at more than 1, but I find that this card just steals so many games. A lot of times you'll have monsters on your field that have just outused their effects. Maybe you'll have a random Darklord Ixchel on the board who isn't doing you much, its level's not very good, or a Nastin and you don't have another level 7, so you can just tribute into Darklord Morningstar, which is a 3000 body, which is fantastic. It can recur you some life, but most importantly, you'll be able to summon your Darklord Zerato from the deck, and then just wipe your opponent's board and attack for what is most likely going to be game. That wraps it up for the Darklord cards. Next we're going to play 2 Arklord Christias. This card is the reason why the deck works the way it does. This deck isn't meta by any means, but just about any deck in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Relies heavily on special summoning, and if you just are able to drop an Arklord Christia and just sit on it, because it prevents your opponent from special summoning, sure, it'll prevent you from doing it as well, but it's got a big enough body to where you shouldn't mind if you have this and another monster on board. If your opponent doesn't have a spell or trap card that can out this monster, you're going to win that game more than likely, and even if they do, this card floats. It'll recycle itself, and you can just use it again next turn. This card is amazing. You have to run at least 2. To further exemplify that strategy, another 2 of is Vanity's Fiend. Now, same difference, except just a different way to summon it, basically. It'll just require 1 tribute, in the event that you don't have the graveyard requirement for Darklord Christia or anything like that. Just having 4 copies of basically Vanity's Emptiness in monster form is spectacular, and opponents in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Just don't know how to handle this. Wrapping up the monster lineup, we of course have to play a few hand traps to make this deck work, and that is our 3 of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This card isn't nearly as expensive anymore with its 2 reprints, but it is still as competitive as ever, as it can shut down just about anything that any modern meta deck today will try to use. Now with our monsters out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to our spells. Our spell cards, as we do not run any traps. I was about to say spells and traps. First and foremost, we gotta play 3 Banishment of Darklords. This is your Searcher, which it is absolutely incredible, I must add, that with monsters like Darklord Thickshell and Darklord Nastin, who can just reuse cards like Banishment and, say, Darklord Contact, once you've already used them once, they can use that effect if the card's in the graveyard, and then you get the card back in your deck, so you can dig for it later in the game. Next, as I mentioned, of course, you're going to play your 3 Darklord Contact, basically a Monster Reborn, but also a Darklord card. It's searchable by Banishment, and abusable with Ixchel and Nastin. Gotta max out on those cards. As that wraps up the Darklord spell card engine, now for our ridiculous amount of other draw power. Triple Pot of Desires. I love this card. I'll play this in basically any deck that I run. I don't mind banishing the 10 cards by any means, as we're playing 3 of most things. And even if you, since we only run 2 Christia and Vanity's Fiend, well, if you manage to banish both of those, and you don't have a way to prevent your opponent from special summoning, that's where your extra deck plays will come in. This deck can function without that. That just is incredibly beneficial if you manage to pull that off. Now for the rest of our draw power, we'll have the 1 Upstart Goblin. This should be at 3, but what can you do? Triple Trade-In. We have so many level 8 targets for it. It is absolutely ridiculous. Trade-In puts Superbia in the graveyard to be interacted with later with Monster Revival. It'll unclog your hand with monsters that are level 8 that are just stuck there. Gotta play Triple Trade-In. And lastly, for draw power, we're only running the 2 Allure of Darkness, and that's because I find more often than not the cost is really rather steep that you have to banish one of your dark monsters. If it was just discarding it, the card would of course be absolutely broken, but this deck runs so much graveyard interaction that you really want every single one of your dark monsters in the grave so that you can interact with it later on, right? Well, with the exception of maybe Vanity's Fiend. But that'll do it for the draw power. This deck goes through all 40 cards in a turn and a half, but in this day and age, that's an entire duel, right? Spot removal, 1 Dark Hole, 1 Raigeki. If they shut down your way to get to Darklord Zerato, you've got to have a way to out your opponent's extra links and problematic boss monsters and things like that. For Revival, we play the 1 Monster Reborn because we can now, and the 1 Soul Charge. Soul Charge is absolutely broken in this deck. You resolve this, it doesn't matter that you can't go into your battle phase. Chances are you've set up to where your opponent can't special summon, you've gone into your extra deck and set up several negates on board. If you resolve Soul Charge in this deck, that's GG. And then lastly, we've got 1 copy of Foolish Burial, as well as 1 copy of Foolish Burial Goods. Foolish Burial, you're going to want to dump the occasional Darklord Superbia in there, and Foolish Burial Goods, you're going to want to dump your Darklord spell cards so that they can be cheated out with cards like Ixchel and Nastin. So that wraps it up for the main deck. Now let's get on to the extra deck. We're rarely ever going to go into the extra deck, but it's nice to have these cards. Anyway, first off, we've got to run our Spider package. For those of you who don't know, number 84 Pain Gainer, and number 77 the Seven Sins. I have stole games with this card more times than I can count. I've come back from Droll and Lockbird Trickstar Reincarnation combos with this card. No one ever sees it coming, and this will steal you games every single time. We'll show you how to get to that here in just a second. Couple rank 10 trains, shout out to Rada, good for little burn damage here or there, little monster protection here, and then they're both, of course, just enormous bodies that you want to have on board if at all possible. Next we're going to go into our Galaxy package. We run the one Hope Harbinger Dragon. Absolutely amazing card. Glad that it got reprinted finally. It's more accessible to the public now. But stealing your opponent's spell cards and just adding more material to it is amazing, and then making it the only attack target, say preventing your opponent from being able to hit your Darklord Christia or even your Vanity's Fiend. This is an incredible card for the deck. For the Galaxy Eyes monsters, we'll run the one Cypher Dragon, the one Cypher Blade Dragon, and the one Dark Matter Dragon. Now, let me talk to you about something here for just a moment. I've seen a lot of very, very accomplished Yugi-tubers, very smart people, very influential people in this community, people who have inspired me to do what I'm doing just now. But there's a common mistake here that I absolutely just have to address. A lot of these people will talk about, like, Xyz stacking these cards, getting the use of Cypher Dragon, and then overlaying it into Cypher Blade Dragon, getting your use out of that, going into, say, Full Armor Photon Dragon, popping the monster, and then ending on Dark Matter Dragon, and just attacking twice for game. This does not work. And it's because of some clauses here on these two cards, as well as on Full Armor Photon Dragon. These cards cannot be used as Xyz material. So when you're running a Galaxy Eyes package, you really have to be careful what you're picking to use. Which one of these monsters best fits the situation you're in, because you're only going to be able to resolve one of their effects. Just a little heads up on anybody who wants to run Galaxy packages in any level 8, rank 8 spam decks that you may be playing. But wrapping up the rank 8s, we run the Lancelot and the Zombiestein. Zombiestein's an absolutely astonishing 4500 body, as well as a bit of a roundabout negate, but a negate all the same, and you can never have too much of those. Lancelot, same deal. You got your negate on board. Not as big of a body, but probably more versatile in most situations. Lastly, with the Xyz monsters, we have the one Big Eye, getting to overlay a couple Nastins, and stealing your opponent's monsters, always good. That will never, ever get power crept, I don't believe. Now, probably the one Link monster that you're going to go into in this deck may be Decode Talker, and that's if you can resolve something like Soul Charge, or a bunch of Monster Reborn's Darklord contacts, or anything like that. It'll end up being another big body, and it's a negate, and in this day and age, negates are almost everything. Now that's 12 cards. For the last 3 to make 15, we run the Boral Boys. We've got Beauregard, Borreload, and Boral Sword Dragon. Really happy about this one. I actually just recently picked Boral Sword Dragon up for an absolute steal, and I can't wait until I can play it in a deck that actually uses it. Now, this deck is never going to go into a Link 4 monster ever. So why do I run these cards, you might ask? And, well, that's because we side deck Ghost Reaper. Now let's use that as our transition. So for our side deck, we start off with just the one copy of Ghost Reaper. I don't think we're ever going to really go into this that much. This is for in problematic games where your opponent's they're just really good at using problematic monsters from their extra deck, and the aggressiveness of this deck isn't cutting it by itself. You can just side in the 1, adds a little bit of extra help. 2 if you want, but I don't think you're going to go into it that much. Meaning, of course, that the last 3 monsters in your extra deck, you can sub out for the Boral Dragons for any 3 extra deck monsters that you have a problem personally going up against. Moving on, we have the 3 Wing Dragon of Raw Sphere mode. Now, this, in my opinion, has just completely power-crept kaijus. I couldn't tell you the last time I've seen an opponent play a kaiju, and with just link spamming the board, as we've seen in the past few formats of the game, getting rid of multiple problematic monsters in non-targeting, non-destructive ways, it's absolutely busted. This is probably the best monster removal that we have in this format. Wrapping up the monsters in the side deck, we have 3 Chaos Hunters. Now, this one's a bit more situational, but I think will work just fine. It basically is a pretty sizable body, another trade-in target, and it stops your opponent from banishing cards. Now, you're not going to stop them from using their Pot of Desires, because its summoning condition happens when your opponent special summons something, and chances are they're going to resolve their draw power before summoning, but there's still plenty of cards and decks that rely on banishing to extend their plays, and this will just shut that down. This is a very, very useful side card. Moving on to the spells of the side deck, we just run the Triple Twin Twister. It's another way to put Darklord monsters, or anything else you really need, into your graveyard, and it's spell and trap removal, macro removal, which this deck doesn't necessarily have a lot. So if you're running into like an Altergeist player or something like that, this could be definitely a useful card to side in. Now, wrapping up the side deck, we actually do run a few traps. We got the 1 Mask of Restrict. You never know if your opponent is using Raw Sphere mode against you, or any other deck that might try to utilize the Tribute Summon mechanic. You can just shut that down entirely with this card. And then the 3 Red Reboot. I find that this is probably more useful in many ways than cards like Evenly Matched or even Infinite Impermanence, because the majority of people are going to try to use those cards themselves, whereas you, knowing that they're going to do that, just run these much more accessible cards that are hard counters to them, and you'll shut down cards that they spent upwards of $20 to $100 on, and probably still end up winning that game. Well, that's going to end up doing it for my first deck profile of Darklords in the month of October 2018. I'm going to have more of these coming for you, and there's one in particular that I'm currently working on, going to be the absolute spiciest competitive deck you have ever seen in your life, guaranteed. So, if you want to see that, be sure to comment what you think the deck is, like the video, and always be sure to subscribe to help me be able to continue doing this, but most importantly, stay thick, everyone.
Extra thick!